So, I don't know if you heard this or not, but the voice of America, it is being defunded. But is this a good thing? And what is it exactly? We will find out. I'm Charles Randolph, and welcome to Speak Online, where we will review the media coverage, check the spin, and find out what's real. So please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It is time to watch and reflect. Before we get started, a quick note, you can get 40% off a subscription to Ground News today. At Ground News, you can see every side of every news story and through the media bias with reliable news from local to international sources, access to over 50,000 news sources, discover stories you aren't being shown, and the media bias behind every story. I use this service often every day. In fact, you will see me use it on this show to help bring you good information. So please help support the channel and click the link for 40% off Ground News today in the description below. So first, let's find out what the VOA is, a bit of context, and then we will review a few articles and the media. Okay. So, VOA, historical funding. Voice of America, the VOA, the U.S. government-funded international broadcasters, has experienced a dynamic funding history since its inception in 1942, shaped by its evolving role in American foreign policy and global events. And that is one of the key things to this, folks, is its relationship to foreign affairs. It is a big one, a huge one, and you'll find out why. Early years, World War II origins from 1942 to 1945. The VOA was established in 1942 under the Office of War Information, OWI, to counter Nazi propaganda during World War II. Its initial funding was modest, tied to the broader wartime budget and focused on radio broadcasts to deliver U.S. perspectives to international audiences. This marked the beginning of VOA as a strategic communication tool. Now, believe it or not, folks, the U.S. can be a source of propaganda within the U.S. and outside of it as well. Getting our message out to the public in foreign countries is extremely important because we want them to perceive us as we want to be perceived. It's extremely important. So, this came along also in the post-war transition and Cold War expansion from 1945 to 1989. After World War II, VOA's funding faced uncertainty as it transitioned to the State Department in 1945. Some in Congress questioned the need for a peacetime propaganda tool, but the Cold War's onset, highlighted by events like the 1948 Berlin blockade, shifted priorities, recognizing VOA's value in countering Soviet influence. Congress increased appropriations by the 1950s. VOA broadcast in over 40 languages, with funding supporting both radio and emerging television technologies. In 1953, the VOA moved under the newly formed U.S. Information Agency, USIA, where it remained until 1999. During this period, funding greatly grew, and it did it steadily, reflecting America's commitment to soft power and public diplomacy. The late 1980s saw further budget increases to support expanding programming, such as coverage of the pro-democracy movement in China. There is a key term there, soft power. The post-war, Cold War adjustments from 1990s, from 2010, the 1994 International Broadcasting Act shifted VOA oversight to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, later renamed the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, in 2018, aiming to enhance editorial independence while maintaining congressional funding. Post-Cold War budget cuts in the 1990s impacted related services like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, but VOA's funding remained relatively stable. By the early 2000s, its annual budget stabilized around $200 million, peaking at approximately $300 million in recent years, supporting a weekly audience of over 350 million across nearly 50 languages. So again, I think it's really important to note the breadth and how much information is being disseminated to so many different areas on this planet. It's huge, and it pushes our agenda. It is a method of soft power. So, the recent developments, the 2025 budget cuts. In 2025, VOA faced a significant funding reduction under the Trump administration. On March 15th, 2025, the budget was slashed to a minimal level, leading to nearly 1,300 staff being placed on leave. The VOA director, Michael Abramowitz, called it the first silencing in 83 years, a dramatic shift from its historical funding growth. This cut also affected other USAGM outlets like Radio Free Asia, reflecting a broader reevaluation of government funding media. Now, this term, first silencing, what this is referring to is silencing your dissenters. And those people will argue, including myself, that those who silence those who dissent have two things in mind. One, to retain the power that they have, and two, that they fear losing the power and they want to gain it. So, something to consider. The funding mechanism and trends. So, the modest wartime beginnings was in the 1940s. It grew a lot during the significant Cold War growth, and then post-Cold War as well, and there was a recent sharp decline in 2025. Now, moving on to an article. So, this is the nation's pulse, usually recognized as a more right source of news. And let's see how it's framed. And then we'll contrast that to one that's considered on the left. And then we'll take a look at one that's just centered. Now, this was on March 15th, 2025. Trump orders overhaul of U.S. propaganda agency. On Friday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order targeting specific federal agencies for operational reductions, including the parent organizations of U.S. government-funded media outlet Voice of America. This action marks Trump's ongoing efforts to streamline government operations. The order mandates these agencies to scale back their activities to the legal minimum. So, one thing, look at the title. It is a U.S. propaganda agency. So, when it's stated that way, anybody who reads this is going to perceive this from the frame as they are being manipulated and being pushed a certain direction to adopt a set of beliefs. Propaganda is anything meant to sway public opinion. It's when it's misinformation or false that it retains that bad quality. Because I think it's safe to say that most people have an agenda, but it's to the degree and it's the intention that I believe matters a lot. But these terms, these propaganda agency, if you're reading that, they are pushing an extreme agenda. Also, we have the common theme of these streamlining government operations. That's a big one. Next up, among the agencies affected are the U.S. Agency for Global Media, under which Voice of America operates, along with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Radio Free Asia. Additional targets include the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, and the Minority Business Development Agency. Those are a lot of things. That's good that he listed them all. The order specifies a reduction in all functions not explicitly required by law and converts statutory tasks to their minimum implementation. Let me zoom in a little bit. This move signifies the latest step by Trump to transform the federal bureaucracy. That is an awesome word, bureaucracy. When you look it up, it's not a bad thing. But the way that it has been used in the public, it is now considered a very bad thing. But the Department of Government Efficiency has only axed 100,000 positions within the 2 to 3 million member federal workforce, so far putting a freeze on foreign aid and terminating a handful of contracts and programs. Trump previously had disagreements with Voice of America during his first term and has appointed former news anchor Carrie Lake as its director. Interesting. We might want to look into who Carrie Lake is. I'm going to make a note of that. We can find out where she stands on the political spectrum and see if there's any agenda about placing her in that position, right? There was also another note here. He had a link to explicitly required by the law. Where is that going to take us? George Santos is suing Jimmy Kimmel. I have no idea what the hell that has to do with the law. I know what it is meant to do, though, and what it's meant to do is to send you other places so they can get traffic. It's called a backlink, folks. That is the purpose. And that was the end of the article as well. Fantastic. Now, before we move forward, I am an Amazon associate, and recommending books is going to be my thing because I'm all about good sources of information. And my thing will be to provide you with the list of current book recommendations that I'm reading and also provide you for more at my store. Link is in the description below. Current book that I'm reading is called Jesus and John Wayne. Let's see. There you can see it. I can show that through my notes. I'm actually... Wait, can't see it. There we go. There we go. There's some notes. Lots of notes. That I actually read what I'd be selling. It's a very good book. I highly recommend it. It will give you a very interesting perspective on the use of media to push an agenda, but it's also a great historical account of how evangelicalism has been used in order to retain political power. So take a look. It doesn't bash religion at all. It just lists historical accounts. So it's very good. Very good book. Very well written. Engaging. It's not as boring as it might sound. Now, moving forward. So this is from Vanity Fair, and this was listed as leaning left. So let's take a look at how it's framed. We'll see if we can get any more information on things to look up. There was that one note about the law that I'm curious about. The law. To the furthest extent of the law. That's an interesting claim. I might look into that. So, Trump guts Voice of America. News agency Musk says nobody listens to them anymore. Okay. You know, here's, I would say, the purpose behind this. Musk says nobody listens to them anymore. Musk has been painted by the left as an antagonist in the story. By that, I mean a bad guy. And so popping that name on there, it is most likely to target a specific audience. Now, created in 1942 to counter Nazi propaganda, VOA and their sister networks reach 420 million people in 63 languages and more than 100 countries each week. It shows a picture of the VOA at their office, a little billboard. Now, next, I'm drinking some coffee. Thank you for your patience. Very much needed. Now, Voice of America staff were locked out of their offices on Saturday. Could you imagine going to work? Now, as long as I knew that I was getting a paycheck, I'd be like, hell yes, lock me out. Let's do this. But anyway, moving forward, unable to complete planned reporting after President Donald Trump signed an executive order gutting the government-run news agency that the White House has referred to as radical propaganda. Now, I'm hoping this executive order link. Good. This brought us to the presidential action of continuing the reduction of the federal bureaucracy. We will look into that. That's wonderful how it's framed. Wonderful. Now, moving forward, the note of radical propaganda. That is a big one. I'm not going to get into that until a minute here. VOA was founded in 1942, in part to counter Nazi propaganda. We heard all that. The move impacts all full-time staffers at the VOA and the Office for Cuba Broadcasting, which runs radio and television, and is poised to have a devastating effect on practically all operations under the United States Agency for Global Media, the parent entity of VOA and the department targeted by Trump's Friday evening order. According to the agency, which is fully funded by federal dollars, broadcasters and their sister networks reach for, we got that. This is from Michael A. I am deeply saddened for the first time in 83 years. The storied Voice of America is being silenced, VOA Director Michael A. wrote in a LinkedIn post. He shared that his entire staff of 1,300 journalists, producers, and assistants had been put on administrative leave, including himself. That is a ton. Now, one thing that you can notice on that article on the right, they didn't note how many people lost their jobs, right? They leave it to these terms like federal bureaucracy, not people, not individuals. And that's because it's a lot easier to target a term that is vague and not personal rather than an individual. When you start working with individuals, you start to develop a bit of empathy. And that can be a dangerous thing if you're trying to push an agenda. I think that's important. This is back to his quote. Even if the agency survives in some form, the actions being taken today by the administration will severely damage Voice of America's ability to foster a world that is safe and free, and in doing so is failing to protect U.S. interests, he said. A statement released by the White House following the executive order details news coverage by VOA as justification for the defunding, including an article defining white privilege after the murder of George Floyd, a story about whether Russia perpetuated allegations against Hunter Biden to benefit Trump, and a segment on LGBT migrants. So they're using that as a way to justify it. That is their claim for propaganda. That they're pushing the incorrect stories. Just take a note of this. Incorrect stories with an agenda. Like Mr. Biden. Okay. This is another quote from a different individual, Rick Grenell. It's a relic of the past. Trump's special envoy for special missions wrote on X in February, "We don't need government-paid media outlets." Trump's billionaire donor and Department of Government Efficiency advisor, Elon Musk, wrote on a social platform also in February, "Yes, shut them down nobody listens to them anymore, other than the hundreds of millions that are noted. The order entitled Continuing the Reduction of the Federal Bureaucracy called for multiple other departments to be eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law, including the Institute of Museum and Library Services. That I'm so worried about. The Institute of Museum and Library Services. I consider that an extremely important thing, and I'd like to look into it a little bit more. We get time. They have a tweet by Carrie Lake. Breaking. The president has issued an executive order titled Continuing the Reduction of the Federal Bureaucracy. It affects USAGM and its outlets VOA and OCB. If you are an employee of the agency, please check your email immediately for more information. Okay. So there's two sides right there. Before we get into that centered article, I want to take a look at this presidential action, the continuing the reduction of the federal bureaucracy. Now, think about how that's framed. It's not about reducing Voice of America's funding or the Institute of Museum and Library Services funding. This is federal bureaucracy. And you know why? It's because there's a cognitive association embedded in her mind that federal bureaucracy is a bad thing, especially on the right. You're placating to an audience by putting it under this large category of federal bureaucracy. If you knew what the hell it was, you might feel a little bit different. Just something to keep in mind. Now, this article, or not article, this press release, was on March 14th. Quoting, "By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered, Section 1, Purpose. This order continues the reduction in the elements of the federal bureaucracy that the President has determined are unnecessary." Okay. Section 2. Actually, I want to make a comment about that. Notice how this is. This order continues the reduction in the elements of the federal bureaucracy that the President has determined are unnecessary. These funds are appropriated through Congress and legislation that were agreed upon by those that we elected into office. Okay, this wasn't like a hidden deal. This is something that is public information. And the fact that one individual is deciding it rather than, hey, let's take this to Congress, the people who represent the people, and cut this funding, is something to consider. This is very significant, especially the Institute of Museum and Library Services, because I love libraries. But Section 2, back to it, reducing the scope of the federal bureaucracy. There it is again. A, except as provided in subsection B of this section, the non-statutory components and functions of the following governmental entities shall be eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law, and such entities shall reduce the performance of their statutory functions and associated personnel to the minimum presence and function required by law. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the United States Agency for Global Media, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the Smithsonian Institution, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, and the Minority Business Development Agency. Within 7 days of the date of this order, the head of each governmental entity listed in subsection A of this section shall submit a report to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget confirming full compliance with this order and explaining which components or functions of the governmental entity, if any, are statutorily required and to what extent. Man, that is a lot. Now think about trying to cover all this and getting all this information to the public. To go over what each of those institutions does, the amount of time it requires, is a lot. Moving forward. In reviewing budget requests submitted by the government entities listed in subsection A of this section, the Director of Office of Management and Budget, or the head of any executive department or agency charged with reviewing grant requests by such entities shall, to the extent consistent with applicable law, and except insofar as necessary to effectuate an expected termination, reject funding requests for such governmental entities to the extent they are inconsistent with this order. Is that made for the future as well in reviewing budget requests submitted by the government entities listed in okay. Section 3. General provisions. A. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect 1. The authority granted by law to an executive department, agency, or the head thereof, or the functions of the Director of the Office of Management and Budget relating to budgetary, administrative, or legislative proposals. This order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. And lastly, this order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, or agents, or any other person. That is an interesting section. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect. Very interesting. I'm going to copy and paste that. Maybe look into that a little bit later. Maybe ask a legal friend of mine. I find like there's a little bit of catches, and I think there's a catch in that last paragraph. But moving forward now to a more fair and balanced article. This is by the BBC. Now, let's take a look at the headline. Trump moves to close down Voice of America. Now, that's what is actually happening, right? That is what's happening. U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order to strip back federally funded news organization's Voice of America, accusing it of being anti-Trump and radical. A White House statement said the other would ensure taxpayers are no longer on the hook for radical propaganda, including quotes from politicians and right-wing media criticizing the broadcaster. It's very similar to the Vanity Fair, I will admit that. VOA, still primarily a radio service, was set up during World War II. We know that. It mentions all of that. It moves on to noting the 1,300 people that have been put on paid leave. Good for them. Make it as long as you can. Now, it moves to focusing on Mr. Abramowitz said that the order left VOA unable to carry out its vital mission, especially critical today when America's adversaries like Iran, China, and Russia are sinking billions of dollars into creating false narratives to discredit the United States. And that is very, very true. They are also doing it within the United States. And we could see that through them funneling money through tenant media to pay influencers like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin to license their content and push a certain narrative, whether they deny it or not. Their message is obviously not good for the United States and the public if they're being paid for it from Russia. Now, moving forward. The National Press Club, a leading representative group for U.S. journalists, said the order undermines America's longstanding commitment to a free and independent press. It added, if an entire newsroom can be sidelined overnight, what does that say about the state of press freedom? An entire institution is being dismantled piece by piece. This isn't just a staffing decision, it's a fundamental shift that endangers the future of independent journalism at VOA. The president's order targets VOA's parent company, U.S. Agency for Global Media, which also funds nonprofit entities such as Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia. Okay, we got that. CBS, the BBC's U.S. news partner, said the VOA employees were notified in an email. Okay, it's pretty repetitive. They mention Elon Musk, who are overseeing it. It's pretty good. They use a lot of quotations. That's a good thing. Now, one thing that Mr. Abramowitz was mentioning was about independent media and things like that, and the importance of getting different messages out there. Well, it is extremely important, extremely right now. And one of the individuals that got put in the head of Voice America Now was Carrie Lake. I want to look into her. I want to see who she is. Carrie Lake. Halperlin. Born August 23, 1969, is an American political figure and former television news anchor who has served as a special advisor to the United States Agency for Global Media. First thing, former television news anchor. Now, has anyone noticed that there are individuals that have been in the media that are taking critical positions in the government? For example, one of the most recent ones is Dan Bongino. Dan Bongino. Now, I will admit, both of these individuals have past experience. She has one as television news anchor. That doesn't mean that she actually knows anything about media, though, and it's facts. And Mr. Bongino, he was part of the Secret Service. But it's something to consider about who you surround yourself with and the purpose behind it. Also, legacy media being kicked out of some of the areas which they usually have access to, and instead bringing influencers in, which sadly are perceived as sources of good information, but clearly have their own agenda. And sadly, a huge amount of social capital, undeserved for their position, in my opinion. They're perceived as a source of information, and it's bad. They're a source of opinion, one that is usually not deserved. Okay. She ran for a couple offices, began her career in the 1990s in the media. She stepped down. She was part of his campaign, blah, blah, blah. December 24th. Early life and education. This is what I want. Carrie Lake was born in 1969 in Rock Island, Illinois, to Larry and Sheila Lake, who were natives of the Wisconsin communities. Larry taught Lake grew up in Iowa. She graduated from North Scott Senior High School and then received a Bachelor's of Arts in Communication and Journalism from the University of Iowa. I wonder why she got a Bachelor of Arts in Communication. It must have been different back then, as I have a Bachelor of Science in Communication. But then again, I did focus more on science, but that's interesting. So that's it. She is somewhat informed. She does have some qualifications. I really hope that she took the media ethics course, which was required when I was in college, because we definitely need it right now. So, interesting. Very interesting. What were some other notes that I took here? Oh, yeah. I want to look into the Institute of Museum and Library Services real quick. Maybe getting a little bit off track, but I think it's important to know what the heck this is. It's interesting going after things, and there was more than one that have to do with our history. Like the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the Smithsonian Institution. By history, I mean those things that are meant to keep records. Interesting. Let's find out what this is. Institute of Museum and Library Services. Tell me what you are. Very nice website, that's for sure. Where's our About Us section? How to apply funding, additional resources. Learn about IMS. Let's do that. Okay. Their mission. IMLS envisions a nation where individuals and communities have access to museums and libraries to learn from and be inspired by the trusted information, ideas, and stories they contain about our diverse natural and cultural heritage. Wow. So far, I'd say this is a pretty damn good thing. Our strategic plan, the IMLS strategic plan for FY 2022, so fiscal year through 2026, outlines our strategic goals that underpin the agency's programs and services. These include being a champion of lifelong learning, strengthening community engagement, advancing collection stewardship and access, and demonstrating excellence in the public service. It talks about their board, legislation and budget. Most activities of the Institute of Museum and Library Services are authorized by Chapter 72 of the Title 20 of the U.S. Code as a federal agency administering discretionary federal programs. IMLS receives its funding through the annual appropriations process. Good. They have peer review. Very good. Priority areas. The Institute of Museum and blah, 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 supports a diverse set of priority areas spanning social, cultural, educational, scientific, and historical information. I'm going to look into a little bit more of their mission for more details. So their strategic goals that they note is to champion lifelong learning. Museums, libraries, and archives are an unparalleled source of educational information, health, job, and cultural resources. IMLS supports these institutions' work to open themselves up to all community members and visitors, bridging the gaps of distance, resources, or experience. So this, like, historical records that they continue to mention, those are very important things, because 50 years from now, maybe just 20 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, people will be going into the records and saying, what happened, either good or bad. That's important to note. Either good or bad. But what happened? What was the sociological circumstances that were going on in this time to cause X? Where did these social movements occur? What happened and why? I don't know if you noticed, but there are things that were very popular in the past, like witch burnings, like, hey, that was a good time, cool, right? That we now look back on and be like, what the hell were we thinking? Like, what the hell were we thinking? It was just like a cool pastime, like, get the boys together, let's go do this, a normal Saturday night. But now it's not considered okay, which I agree. But just something to consider about the importance of historical documents. It's very important. Very important. 2, strengthen community engagement. Museums, libraries, and archives can connect community members to develop or enhance a collective sense of place where everyone can feel respected and included. IMLS enables these institutions and their partners to foster dialogue that addresses and incorporates diverse community needs and experiences. That's important. Another good thing. 3. Advanced collection stewardship and access. Museums and libraries are responsible for preserving, managing, providing the broadest possible access to the cultural, artistic, historical, natural, and scientific collections entrusted to their care. And 4. Demonstrate excellence in public service. IMLS recognizes the importance of reflective practice and continual improvement in our commitment to the agency's mission to advance, support, and empower America's museums, libraries, and related organizations. Another important thing about this that libraries do is, sadly, to some information, particularly academic information, you have to pay to get access to certain journals, especially those that are very well known and very popular. For example, Nature. But they will have a license that they have purchased, and you can then go to the library and access it through their network to get that information. And that is really important. That is really important. It allows any person to walk in there and get good information. We have a little interesting did you know fact thing here, which I'm going to look at. In 2024, the Institute of Museum and Library Services awarded $266.7 million through grant making, research, and policy development to advance, support, and empower America's museums, libraries, and related organizations. That is awesome. That is awesome. I'm really concerned about this. I wonder just how much is being cut and just how much it will affect them. I wish it gave me a little bit better idea at like the scope at what they operate, just how much this is going to affect. Here's our legislative budget. Notice how it says legislation. That's because it was passed by our Congress. It is not some evil bureaucracy. This is all legit, where here, again, the information is not hidden, people. Certain people, in particular the right, always say, oh man, this stuff's hidden. Like, you can't get to this shit. Like, some backdoor policy, whatever, you can't get it. All you gotta do is just look it up and fucking click on it. Check it out. Here's some legislation. Museum and Library Services Act 2018, Museum and Library Services Act 2010. Here's one in 2020. We can go back. Here's the appropriations request for fiscal year 2025. Congressional justification. We got about how many appropriations requests? You can look it all up for all the funding that they are requesting. 46 pages of where it will go for, the purpose of it, everything. You know, like, this stuff is public information, people. It's not hidden away. I mean, when you write a grant, and I have, you know, you put all the details about it. Like, here it is. IMLS, history of administration costs. They put this all out there, you know, in order to provide an estimate and justification for how much money that they are requesting. They go all the way back for the fiscal year 2022 to 2025. You know, there has to be reasons behind this. You just don't ask for it. There's work. There's people getting paid to put this together. Funds requested, funds rewarded, match cost share. Oh, here we go. Museum services, discretionary grants. Map 3, fiscal year 2023. Museum discretionary grant distribution. So this is what they awarded. I can tell you what the map shows, at least where they have granted money, and it is all over the U.S. All over the U.S. Here's another. Library grants to states distribution, all over the U.S. I just cannot stress enough the importance and value of education for the public. It's extremely important. Extremely important. So we went through these articles. We found out what Voice of America is. We're able to look at the left and the right, figure out how both are skewed. And I think, get some good information out there. So I think when it comes to my agenda that I would like to push is for people to consider the effect of the dissent, of silencing the dissent of those who disagree with us, and labeling certain things as propaganda, because it's very easy to do that, but whether it is or not, and to the degree that it is another thing. Because you can say anything's propaganda if you disagree with it, but it might just be the truth, and you might just not fucking like it. That could be the reality of the situation. It's how it's presented, the language that's used, and the information provided that determines it. Really something important to consider. And then another point here is for people to look out for these little taglines and key phrases like this bureaucracy and stuff like that, because, just like we did when we looked into this stuff, like you can say it's the bureaucracy and just do that, but it's a little bit different when you look into it. This is going to take funds away from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which I think we can all agree is a very good thing after looking into it. This money goes to educating our children, for those who have them, and that is a very important thing. And it's a very important thing also for historical documents and access to information. This Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the Smithsonian Institution, these are all very good things. The Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, these are legitimate things. And then another thing, you can get access to this information. These things are public. They're not hidden. You can go and do it. It doesn't take a lot of work. You got to read. But don't believe it when you hear that. Take some time to be critical about it. Okay, I think that's what I got for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And join us on our podcast on Spotify. And come check out our live streams on TikTok, YouTube, Rumble, and read our articles on To Speak Online. Thank you again, everybody. Be sure to check out that Ground News affiliate link down below in the description. And we'll see you hopefully tomorrow. Take care.